Kim Gattas, first of all, the hypothesis of the book Black Wave, which is translated into Romanian at Humanitas, the hypothesis of your book is that the main problem with this precarious situation in the Middle East is the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's adding to the other issue, which is the root problem, let's say, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So how do the two problems look when they are put together?
Like a very big problem. Magda, first of all, thank you very much for speaking to me. I'm delighted to speak to your audience in Romania and my readers for the book Black Wave. It's really great to have it translated in Romanian. What I wanted to do with Black Wave is take a step back from the headlines, take a step back from the usual explanations that are very focused either on America's involvement in the region or the Arab-Israeli conflict. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that I'm ignoring those two aspects of the difficulties we face in the region, mm-hmm. but I wanted to focus on the role and the agency that countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia have when it comes to the increasing difficulties that we have in this region, the problems we have with stability, with militias, with the use of religion. And so you're absolutely right that when you put all of this together, it makes for a complex region where there are no easy answers, no easy solutions. However, I do want to say that doesn't mean that there are no solutions and that there is no hope on the horizon. It's easy to say, oh, well, you know, the Middle East, it's always been complex, it's always been difficult, they've always been fighting each other. What I demonstrate with the book is that, in fact, the sectarian tension that we've seen and the violence that we've seen over the last few years was not always the case. And more importantly, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not eternal and doesn't have to be eternal. It started really in 1979, which is the year that I pinpoint as the start of a new phase in this region's complicated history.
Can these processes be reversed? Can the Arab world, Iran, Saudi Arabia, return before 1979?
You know, nothing is ever as before. I look at the United States today, I look at the increasingly divisive politics, and I look at how hopeful people were on the Democratic side that if Joe Biden would be elected, they would erase 4 years and go back to how things were.
And 2 years later?
It doesn't work like that, because as time passes, people's frame of reference change, people's norms change, people separate from others, gaps form, you start liking your neighbor less, you start hating someone more, you stop reading certain books or stop watching certain films. And that is not something you can reverse easily. Even if somehow, hypothetically, tomorrow, Iran and Saudi Arabia would declare that they're best friends. I mean, this is hypothetical. You know, the impact of the last 40 years on people's psyche cannot be reversed that quickly. It's a generational effort. But when you look at what Mohammed bin Salman is doing in Saudi Arabia, you see that reversing conservatism and puritanism and sectarian hatred can be achieved and can be pushed forward, but it takes time. What Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do in Saudi Arabia, and I have a lot of criticism for some of the other things that he's doing, but when the social cultural improvements that he's providing for the Saudi generation, it's quite incredible what he's managed to do in 5 years. If he suddenly stops tomorrow, if he suddenly disappears tomorrow, those gains over the last 5 years are not yet sunk into society. So that's why I say that these changes take a generation. We didn't wake up all of a sudden after 1979 and started, having Sunnis killing Shias and Shias killing Sunnis. It took some time. It took some time. It started unfolding slowly, and that is already ebbing as well. So 40 years of change cannot be reversed quickly, but it doesn't mean it's irreversible.
Yeah, we see that in Romania, actually in all these ex-communist countries, but
Yes.
we've got help
Yes,
from
when the
European
Berlin
Union.
Wall falls,
Yeah.
exactly, when the Berlin Wall falls, certain habits, certain traditions, certain ways of doing things remain, because that's just become who you are.
Yeah, but we had the West. We had the example of the West, you know, we had the critical mass of the West, of the Western society. So this is the question, because, you know, you advise us to look at the Middle East, not from the Western perspective in general, but through the eyes of the countries in the region. But you also said that the Western expectation that at some point there will be a critical mass, a critical society in Middle East that will trigger the necessary changes is somehow unfair. But is there such a critical mass in these societies?
What I try to do with Black Wave is to show how many people in this region are fighting every day against this black wave that I described. Because what the West often does in its headlines about the region is focus on the terrorists and the dictators. And we are so much more than that. You know, can you imagine if during the time of communism and the wall separating East from West, we had reduced everyone to the leaders of these countries and erased, you know, the societies and the people trying to make a change or trying to fight back? You know, we would have completely missed the spring of Prague, because we would not have accepted that it was possible that these society can try to effect change from within. Similarly, in the Arab region and in the Muslim world, you have a lot of people who are fighting back, who are dying sometimes because of that. You know, the women who say no today in Iran against the repressive regime there, they've been saying no for a long time. And you had women saying no in Pakistan during the 80s against the dictator there, Zia al-Haq. You have writers and authors and artists in Egypt saying no as well. Why are they not reaching a critical mass? It's because the people they're opposing are ready to use violence. And wherever violence comes to the fore of political expression, it becomes very difficult for the people to win against that violence, because, you know, you're willing to die once and others are maybe willing, but you know, sometimes you have your own considerations, your families, your children, your parents. Not everyone is willing to die in the name of moderation. I do, however, want to say that the other problem we have in the region is American and European support for dictators who continue to enable some of these policies that are detrimental to our societies. And why does the West do that? Not out of willful hatred for us as a region, but out of a desire for stability. Change takes time, but change is messy. We saw that with the Arab uprisings. And so there is a preference for having leaders who can maintain things, you know, ensure Israel's security, ensure the flow of oil. And so you end up with leaders like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, who was later deposed, or you know, a royal family in Saudi Arabia who has, you know, there's a lot to criticize about them. When you support such stability at the expense of real progress within societies, then, you know, that causes a kind of repression which leads to violence as well. Because Hosni Mubarak empowered Islamists so that he could say, I need to stay in power. Otherwise, you'll have the Islamists.
It's the same in Syria. It was the same in Syria at the beginning.
Absolutely.
And look at Syria now.
It was the same in Syria. Bashar al-Assad would say, well, if you don't want me, you're going to have Al-Qaeda or this group or that group. Whereas actually he was releasing all these people from prison.
And
I don't blame Western policymakers for not being able to figure out how to deal with this balance, because security is important, but we need to be able to think outside the box for this.
Yeah, you are telling that this perspective is manichaeist. We have Islamist and we have dictatorship. This is almost a stereotype. But is it the same, for example, with Erdogan right now? Because for the West, Erdogan now is a good politician because Putin is the bad guy in the story.
You know, it's about realpolitik,
Yeah,
and the values that you identify with most. And when President Biden says today it's autocracies versus democracies, you know, unfortunately, even in that fight, you're going to have some autocrats on your side, but hopefully they're autocrats who are not about to invade another country, right? So
yeah.
we're hoping that Erdogan can, you know, be a positive partner in this alliance, whereas clearly Iran is not going to be in no way a partner in that alliance. But that doesn't mean that we should allow Erdogan to get away with what he's doing internally.
Yeah.
And that's what I find so hard in realpolitik, even though I understand it. I think we can do better. You know, we can do better. We can have a COP27 summit in Egypt and still ask Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to release Ala Abdel Fattah, a activist, blogger, British Egyptian citizen who's been in prison for nothing, for being a voice of hope in the region. He's, you know, on a hunger strike for 200 days.
Yeah.
He's now on a water strike, and he is very likely to die in prison. It should be possible to engage governments like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, while at the same time making clear that they need to include their societies in the way forward.
Yeah, about this ongoing protest from Iran, what chances do they have to succeed, or what will it take for them to succeed? I believe that women in Iran have some kind of bad luck because we all are concerned about the war in Ukraine, and we forgot about Iran, about the woman in Iran. We are talking all the time about Russia, but...
Well, you know, when Iran sends drones to help Russia fight Ukraine, then I think Europe is paying attention to the women of Iran. So I agree with you that in some ways, the headlines out of Iran are obscured by the events in Ukraine, but it's all interconnected these days. There is no over there. It's everywhere. Everything is everywhere. You know, sorry, that's not a very eloquent way of saying things, but everything is interconnected, right? So you cannot ignore what's happening in Iran because it's connected to what is happening in Ukraine. Yeah. What are the chances of success? I think it's going to take a long time, and it depends how you define success.
Yeah.
Are the protesters, and they're not just women, you know, today it's across over 80 cities, it's several 100,000 people, it is men and women.
Many young people,
many young people, different classes of society that are not just protesting about the right to choose whether they want to wear the veil or not, but also protesting against corruption, protesting against oppression, protesting against, you know, very difficult economic conditions. So they are you know, out on the streets pushing for change, for improvement. It's going to take a long time. You know, the revolution that brought down the Shah in the late 70s did not just happen in a few weeks in 1979. It was over a year of protests. And it depends, as I said, how we define success. I don't think that what the outcome is going to be, I don't think that the outcome is going to be a secular, modern government, right? It's going to be messy in the short term. It's possible that we have a scenario where the armed forces and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, powerful body in Iran, tries to find a way where they can save the regime by removing some people and presenting a more acceptable face and offer some reforms, but it will still be a military dictatorship, but perhaps a secular dictatorship. A lot depends on the health and the longevity of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who's 83,
the biologic longevity.
Yes, the biological, the human longevity, whether is, whether he's going to, be alive for how long, because that provides an opportunity when he does die. That provides an opportunity for the regime to change the nature of the face it presents to the outside world without admitting that they did this under pressure. It will be a more organic, natural way. Well, now that Ali Khamenei is gone, there is really no one like him. We're going to appoint a supreme leader, but we think it's time to do it differently. He will no longer be supreme. He will just be, accompanying, the regime and so on. But, you have the possibility that this will become another Syria, where because they have nowhere to go, the regime and its defenders feel that they have to fight to the death. So it's tricky. And I think, to go back to the beginning of the question, I think it is part of this moment in time that we're seeing that is about progressive democratic values and authoritarian oppression. It is about Ukraine versus Russia and about Iranians versus their regime. I see this as part of the same moment, all the way to Brazil and the rejection of Bolsonaro.
It's like a war, a fight between autocracy and democracy. We know that democracy is imperfect, but it's not dictatorship.
I would say democratic values, because there are a lot of people fighting for democratic values who live under autocracies, right? So it should not be an alliance of democratic countries versus authoritarian countries. It should be an alliance of, progressive, liberal-minded people versus oppression.
What you are saying, it is not so much about political leaders and states. It is about societies. Also. How does today Iran and Saudi Arabia speculate their religion for this rivalry between them?
So I think religion has really receded as a tool for both Saudi Arabia and Iran, because after 40 years of using religion and sectarianism, I think leaders in both countries have realized that it doesn't appeal to young generations. So in both Saudi Arabia and Iran, they're resorting more to nationalism, for the nation, for your leader, for your country. And even, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, has said or tried to appeal to the younger generation and say, even if it's not about religion, you should support your armed forces, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, to protect your country. And in Saudi Arabia, we've had the same. We've had this shift towards nationalism and pride in the country and pride in the identity, festivals about Saudi Arabia, celebrating independence and things like that. Because Mohammed bin Salman, who's very young himself, he's in a way also Generation Z to some extent, or a bit older, realizes that this young generation, they want to live, they want to have fun, they want to learn, they want to travel, they want to go to the movies. And so he's giving them what they want, but wrapping it in some somewhat dark nationalism as well, where you're not allowed to speak out against the leader, where you're not allowed to criticize, where you're not allowed to even retweet somebody without ending up in jail. So nationalism also has its, its dark sides, and we've certainly seen that with Mohammed bin Salman.
And is the root cause for many wars, this nationalism.
Absolutely. Around the world. Yeah,
we had recently elections in Israel, and we saw that Benjamin Netanyahu is coming back. It seemed to be impossible 1 year ago, but he's coming back, and
nothing is ever impossible with Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah, but the big news is that the religious parties in Israel, the right religious parties, have a big success right now in Israel. How does this election and the situation in Israel can impact the Arab world?
So I think it's important to make very clear that it's not a surprise. And it's not a black to white or white to black change in Israel, because this happens on a continuum, right? We've had the rise of the right wing in Israel. We've had the rise of settler power. We've had the rise of impunity when it comes to settler actions and violence against Palestinians who continue to live under very humiliating and painful occupation. So I think it's important not to see this as a surprise, but more as a continuation of a trend that really started with, in Israeli politics, certainly, that started with the assassination of Rabin in the 90s. How
and
is
the
this going to
politician who
affect...
was involved there is now, he will be in the government.
Indeed. And so how will it affect the region? I think the countries that are watching most closely are the Arab countries who either have a peace agreement with Israel, Jordan and Egypt, or who are part of the Abraham Accords, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, I think is in there as well. And then, the Sudan is getting closer, and so on. I think they're quite worried because they need to be able to maintain this achievement, what they see as their achievement with Israel, to forge peace according to their term, even though it's very detrimental to the Palestinians. So I think they'll be watching very closely. They'll be speaking as much as they can with their counterparts to try to caution against certain moves, like moves on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I don't think that they'll be able to do much about settler encroachment that continues on Palestinian land. So it's a tricky moment.
Yeah, it's a tricky moment, and I saw that all the Netanyahu supporters, for example, are expecting now the return of Trump. Like they are in the same story.
Yes, and I think that some Arab governments would like to see the return of Trump as well. We're still waiting through the results of the elections for the midterms in the US today. It's the day after. It will take a few days to get the full results. It was not as bad as the Democrats anticipated. It's not a red wave. I saw somewhere written it's a red ripple. Right? It's a red ripple. So they lost some key states, but they won some very good ones, including in Pennsylvania. Governor of New York is still a Democrat. Imagine New York with a Republican governor. Senator from Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, has won. But they've had a few losses. Stacey Abrams in Georgia. Texas is still Republican. So it's a mixed bag, but it looks more positive than anticipated for the Democrats. And it is, I think, we're still deciphering all the details. It is the best performance in a midterm election for an incumbent party. Usually the incumbent party, so the president in the White House and his party, do very badly at the midterm election 2 years after the presidential election. This is unusual. So I think we need to give President Biden credit for doing quite well without being a great performer on stage, because he gets criticized a lot. But I think he deserves much more credit for quietly working away and providing good results,
and not speculate the cleavages in American society.
Yes, and also I think we have to give Republicans credit for making some terrible mistakes, like going all out on the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court, which reversed constitutional access to abortion rights. This was a big issue in this midterm election. It rated number 2, because Democrats got really worried about what else could happen if Republicans got more wins in Congress, in the Senate, and so on. So with this win, or this better than expected performance in the midterm elections, I think 2024 is going to be interesting. I don't think we should write off the Democrats. I don't think we should write off President Biden. Is he going to run? I don't know. You know, I was just in the US speaking to some people there in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. There is a sense that President Biden will just be too old by 2023, 2024 to run. On the other hand, there's a sense that there is really no one in the Democratic Party who can win against Trump if Trump decides to run. So it's going to be tricky.
Yeah, right. So this is my last question. In your book,
Sure.
you are talking about these three key events in the Middle East. So is this Iranian revolution, the siege of Mecca, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? But can these three events explain now the Arab world?
I think we're still living with the aftermath of these three events. And I'll tell you to what extent we are still living with these three events. First of all, you have the Saudi and Iranian rivalry that starts then, that continues to this day, right? So when you have protests in Iran today against the regime, what does Iran do? Try to see whether it can strike at Saudi Arabia to, you know, divert attention from what's happening domestically. The invasion of Afghanistan, the aftermath of that, the rise of Al-Qaeda, the proliferation of Islamist groups, you know, that's still an issue in Syria. One of the reasons why the Obama administration thought it's not a good idea to arm rebels inside Syria against the Assad regime is because, according to them, they thought, well, look at how Afghanistan turned out. That didn't turn out great, right? So we're living with some of the aftermath. The dynamics in some places have changed. Sectarianism has receded, but nationalism has increased. And it still informs how we operate today in the region. That's not to say that we're still the same as in 1979. Otherwise, women would not be able to drive in Saudi Arabia. And women would not be able to go to the movies and to football stadiums. Otherwise, you know, the women in Iran wouldn't be protesting against the mandatory veil because they would still be in the very immediate aftermath of the revolution, uncertain of where to go. But because we are 40 years later, I really think that there is a black wave that is receding, that religion is becoming less important, and that we have a new generation that wants to move forward in a more progressive, more liberal, more constructive, more productive way. This is Generation Z, Gen Z, as we call them. And they want a say in the construction and the improvement of their countries. They want to vote. They want to run for parliament. We've seen them in Iraq and in Lebanon. We see them now in Iran. We don't really see them yet in Egypt because it's such a repressive society. So those three events explain the Middle East, how it has evolved, and why it's time for a new phase.
You know what shocked me in your book was the way that the West was seduced by Khomeini, the intellectuals of the West. This was something new for me. Like the West was seduced almost by Putin. It was quite...
Yeah, well, at the time they were seduced, or they thought it was not a problem to have people like Khomeini, because what were they worried about? You know, this was the 70s. This was the era of the Soviet Union. This was the era of the fear of the domino effect. And this revolution was not an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution against a dictator. And there were a lot of leftists and nationalists and liberals and Marxists and communists. And so both the Saudis and the Americans were afraid that the Shah would fall and he would be replaced by a pro-Soviet regime. But what it means is that we are always fighting the last battle, whereas we should be looking at the new trends. What's next, right? And I think that's just a really difficult thing to do. I mean, the CIA, you know, got it very wrong at the time, and you know, I think you know the current CIA chief is very good, and I'd be curious to see what he thinks of what is unfolding. The reason why the West was seduced by Putin is a bit different.
Yeah.
I think there is always hope that you can engage and talk and negotiate, and that the idea that prevailed in the 90s, economic liberalism would bring democracy to countries like Russia and China, has proven to be wrong, right? And so I think that's where the West went wrong with Putin. They should talk to us in the region more often. We can tell when somebody has dictatorial tendencies.
That's great. Thank you very much.